There is something almost nobody knows about the Statue of Liberty. Not the construction story, not the engineer behind the metal skeleton, not even the origin of the green copper that everyone recognizes from 1,000 photographs. It is this. The Statue of Liberty was not designed for the United States. It was designed for Egypt. And before that, before any of the familiar story, it was conceived as a monument to the abolition of slavery. Not to an abstract idea of freedom, to the concrete liberation of people who had been enslaved. That original meaning was deliberately erased over time, replaced with a more palatable narrative, more universal, easier to sell to everyone. And that erasure is probably the most important story you have never heard about the most famous monument in the world. But let us go in order, because to understand what the Statue of Liberty actually is, you need to understand what it almost was, what it was supposed to be, and what was done with it after it was finished. Everything begins with a dinner party in 1865. The location is an estate outside Versailles. The host is Édouard de La Boulaye, a French legal scholar and intellectual who is, at this moment, probably the most knowledgeable person outside the United States on the subject of American law and history. He studied the American Constitution with a depth that most Americans never reached. He translated Benjamin Franklin's writings into French. He genuinely believed that the American Republic represented the most important political experiment of the modern era. And at that dinner in 1865, he makes an observation that will change history. The American Civil War has just ended. Abraham Lincoln has just been assassinated. Slavery has been abolished. And France, under the authoritarian rule of Napoleon III, is politically suffocated. La Boulaye looks at these two realities, the American victory and the French oppression, and has an idea. What if France gave the United States a gift? A gift that celebrated not just the friendship between the two nations, but democracy itself, the abolition of slavery, the idea that government exists to serve the people and not the other way around. This is not an innocent idea. It is a carefully coded political message. In the France of the Second Empire, you cannot openly criticize the regime of Napoleon III, but you can fund a monument in another country that celebrates everything your own government suppresses. It is subversion with diplomatic charm. At that dinner sits a 31-year-old sculptor who listens to all of this and immediately starts calculating. His name is Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, and what goes through Bartholdi's mind in that moment is not artistic humility. It is pure ambition. Bartholdi wants to build something impossible to ignore. This obsession with scale does not come from nowhere. Bartholdi grew up fixated on the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A colossal statue that, according to historical tradition, stood at the entrance of the harbor of the island of Rhodes. Ships passed near it. People saw it from far out at sea before they saw anything else on the island. It was a symbol that worked before any inscription, before any explanation, simply through its size and its placement. Bartholdi wants to recreate that. But before he gets to America, he goes to Egypt. In 1869, Bartholdi travels to Egypt to pitch an idea to Khedive Ismail, the ruler of Egypt, who is building the Suez Canal. The idea is a colossal statue of a female figure, dressed in Egyptian peasant robes holding a torch, positioned at the entrance of the Suez Canal as a lighthouse. The proposed name was something along the lines of Egypt carrying the light to Asia. Khedive Ismail declines. The project is too expensive. The Suez Canal is consuming every available resource. Bartholdi files the project away in a mental drawer and moves on. 2 years later, in 1871, he travels to the United States for the first time, sent by La Boulaye to test the waters, speak with political leaders, and find the right location for a monument that does not yet exist, has no funding, that nobody in America has asked for, and that honestly, very few Americans at that moment actually want. And it is on this trip that the moment happens that will define everything. The ship enters New York Harbor at dawn. Bartholdi is on deck. Ahead of him, lower Manhattan begins to appear. Low buildings, busy docks, the city waking up. And between the ship and the island of Manhattan, there is a small, nearly empty island called Bedloe's Island, a partially abandoned old fort. Nothing particularly special. Bartholdi sees it and stops. This is the place. It is not a rational decision. It is a physical certainty. Anyone arriving by ship will see this island before they see Manhattan. Not as an option, as an inevitability. The statue does not need to be sought out. It will appear before you decide to look for it. Bartholdi cabled La Boulaye. I have found the location. But before construction could begin in earnest, Bartholdi had to solve a problem that almost no one mentions. He needed to find the right face. A statue of this scale visible for miles, with a face that needs to be recognizable, commanding, and at the same time universal. It cannot have just any face. It needs to be the right face. There are 2 main theories, and both are fascinating. The first says that the face of the Statue of Liberty is the face of Bartholdi's mother, Charlotte Bartholdi. This theory has reasonable documentary support. Photographs of Charlotte in her later years show a striking resemblance to the statue's face. The strong jaw, the severe features, the expression that does not ask for approval. Bartholdi was close to his mother in a way that bordered on the intense. She was a widow. He was slow to marry. Her influence on his personal and artistic life ran deep. That he might have immortalized her face in a monumental work would not be surprising. The second theory, more contested, suggests that the face was inspired by an Egyptian enslaved woman, part of the original conception that had almost gone to the Suez Canal. When the project was redirected toward America, the Egyptian face was supposedly modified but never entirely erased. Neither theory is definitively proven, and perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said. The most recognized face in the modern world has an unknown identity. Now we arrive at the section that standard accounts treat as technical detail, but which is actually one of the most extraordinary engineering stories of the 19th century. How do you build a 46-meter figure in copper that needs to withstand Atlantic winds for generations, without cracking, without collapsing, without crushing its own pedestal under its weight? Start with the material, copper. Why copper? Not for the color. The original choice of copper has very specific practical reasons. Copper is malleable, meaning it can be shaped into complex forms without breaking. It is relatively light for its volume, which matters when you are stacking tons of metal on top of a pedestal. And it has a chemical property that turned out to be a gift. When exposed to air and moisture over time, copper forms a natural protective layer called patina, a combination of copper carbonates and sulfates that produces the characteristic green color everyone recognizes. And here is something that surprises almost everyone. When the Statue of Liberty was inaugurated in 1886, it was not green. It was reddish-brown, almost the color of a freshly minted American penny. The color we associate with the statue today is the result of decades of chemical exposure to the maritime air of New York Harbor. The transformation took approximately 30 years to complete. The green patina was not planned by Bartholdi. It happened. But back to the construction. The copper sheets covering the statue are approximately 2.4 millimeters thick. For reference, that is roughly the equivalent of 2 American pennies stacked on top of each other. It is an almost absurdly thin layer of metal for a structure of this scale. If you touch the copper wall of the statue from the inside, it gives slightly under the pressure of your fingers. How does this thin copper shell stay standing? The answer is the technique called repoussé, which in French means literally pushed from behind. The copper sheets were hand-hammered over full-scale wooden molds. Each panel was created individually. The curve of a shoulder, the fold of a sleeve, the texture of a face. Workers spent days hammering the same sheet repeatedly, heating and cooling the metal to make it more pliable, working centimeter by centimeter. The scale of this task is difficult to imagine. The complete statue has more than 300 individual copper panels. Each one needed to fit precisely against adjacent panels, needed to have the exact curvature calculated by Bartholdi, and needed to be light enough to be transported disassembled from France to the United States and reassembled in New York. But the copper shell by itself does not stand on its own. It needs a skeleton, and this is where the name that most accounts mention briefly deserves far more attention: Gustave Eiffel. Eiffel was not yet famous in 1879 when Bartholdi hired him. The Eiffel Tower, which would give his name to history, would not be built for another 10 years. What Eiffel had at that moment was a very specific expertise: the construction of metal structures that needed to be simultaneously light, flexible, and extremely resistant. Bridges, viaducts, railway structures. The challenge Bartholdi presented to Eiffel was unprecedented. Create an internal skeleton for a 46-meter statue that could support the copper shell without the two materials destroying each other over time. That second problem is less obvious, but equally critical. When two different metals remain in contact for long periods, especially in a humid and salty environment like a harbor, a process called galvanic corrosion occurs. The metals react chemically with each other, and the more vulnerable one gradually degrades. The internal skeleton Eiffel designed is iron. The shell is copper. Two metals, in contact, in a harbor. Eiffel solved this with an elegant approach. He separated the two metals with a layer of asbestos, an insulating material that prevented direct contact between iron and copper. The central structure, a massive vertical pylon functioning as the statue's spine, connects to the copper shell through a system of smaller bars, each attached to the copper but insulated from the central structure by asbestos. But there is more. Eiffel understood that a completely rigid 46-meter structure in an environment of Atlantic winds would be a disaster waiting to happen. Metal that cannot yield breaks. Instead, he designed a system that allows the statue to move slightly under the wind but in a controlled way. The copper shell can expand in summer heat and contract in winter cold without that movement tearing the panels or loosening the connections. When strong winds hit the statue, it moves, not visibly to the naked eye, not in a way that looks unstable, but the torch, the highest and most exposed point, sways by around 15 centimeters in storm conditions. The Statue of Liberty is alive in the most technical sense possible. It breathes with the weather. While Bartholdi and Eiffel were solving construction problems in Paris, the project was facing a crisis that threatened to sink everything before it ever crossed the Atlantic. The original agreement between France and the United States seemed simple enough. France would fund and build the statue. The United States would fund and build the pedestal. Each country handled its own part. The problem was that the Americans were not holding up their end. The pedestal, designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt in a neoclassical style, was itself a monumental work. 89 feet tall, built over the walls of the old Fort Wood on Bedloes Island, using massive quantities of concrete and granite. The foundation alone, below the waterline, was described at the time as the largest concrete structure ever built in the United States. The total estimated cost for the pedestal was $300,000, an enormous sum for the era. And by the mid-1880s, after years of fundraising campaigns, only a fraction had been collected. Construction on the pedestal had stopped. The American Committee for the pedestal was out of money, and the statue, already nearly finished in Paris, had nowhere to land. There were moments when cities like Boston and Philadelphia offered to host the statue if New York could not fund the pedestal. The idea that the Statue of Liberty might today be standing in Boston is not an exaggeration. It was a real and publicly discussed possibility. It is at this point that a 38-year-old Hungarian immigrant decides to intervene. Joseph Pulitzer had arrived in the United States without a cent. He had worked as a horse groom, a waiter, a mule driver, anything to survive. He had learned English from scratch. He had bought a failing newspaper in St. Louis and turned it into one of the most widely read in the country. In 1883, he bought the New York World, a newspaper that was dying, and within 2 years made it the most widely circulated paper in New York. Pulitzer had an instinctive understanding of what moved ordinary readers, not the wealthy, not intellectuals. Ordinary people, immigrants, workers, families who read the paper at the dinner table, and he launched a campaign. He did not ask the rich to fund the pedestal. He asked everyone. He published in the World a daily updated list of everyone who donated, regardless of amount. $1 appeared on the list as prominently as $100. He wrote inflammatory editorials about national pride. He published reader letters. He built a narrative that the Statue of Liberty belonged to the American people, not to the elites, and that therefore it was up to the people to build the pedestal. It was, in every sense that matters, the first viral campaign in American history. Within 5 months, more than 120,000 people had contributed. The majority gave less than $1. The total amount raised was enough not only to complete the pedestal, but to leave a surplus. The New York World published the name of every donor. School children sent pennies. Factory workers sent weeks of savings. Newly arrived immigrants who could not yet speak English sent the coins in their pockets to help build a symbol of the country they had just adopted. That says something about the Statue of Liberty that no official inauguration ceremony can express. It was literally built by the people. In June of 1885, the disassembled statue arrived in New York aboard the French ship Isère. Disassembled is the right word. The statue had been fully assembled in Paris for verification, piece by piece, and then taken apart into 214 crates. The boxes contained 350 individual copper pieces, numbered, catalogued, carefully packed. The Atlantic crossing encountered storms. The ship carried unusual weight distributed in an unusual way, and there were moments when the crew was not certain they would make it. If the Isère had sunk, the story of the most famous monument in the world would have ended at the bottom of the North Atlantic, reduced to 350 copper pieces scattered across the ocean floor. The ship arrived. Assembly began in 1885 and took just over a year. Workers laboring inside the structure in conditions that were, at best, uncomfortable. Extreme heat in summer, cutting cold in winter, heights sufficient to kill anyone who fell, metal dust and copper shards in the air, no modern protective equipment, no workplace safety regulations as we know them today. On October 28, 1886, the Statue of Liberty was inaugurated in a ceremony that, by historical irony, excluded most of the people for whom the monument supposedly existed. The island was closed to the general public. Only invited guests could attend the ceremony. And among the excluded were women, including the French women who had worked on the fundraising campaigns. They protested from the water in boats, circling the island while the ceremony proceeded without them. A figure of a woman representing liberty was inaugurated at a ceremony from which women were excluded. Now we need to talk about the poem. You probably know the lines. You may have seen them engraved on the pedestal. You may have heard them cited in political speeches. The lines about giving the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. What almost nobody knows is how that poem got there. Emma Lazarus was a New York poet, daughter of a wealthy Sephardic Jewish family. In 1883, she was approached by a fundraising organizer who was trying to raise money for the pedestal through an auction of art and literature. The organizer asked Lazarus to contribute an original poem. Lazarus refused. She did not write poetry on commission, she said. She had other concerns. She was deeply involved in the situation of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Tsarist Russia, arriving in the United States in growing waves, traumatized and without resources. The Statue of Liberty struck her as an elite project, not something connected to the people she was trying to help. The organizer pressed. She asked Lazarus what she thought the monument might mean to the refugees arriving in New York Harbor after weeks at sea, after persecution and fear. Lazarus thought for a moment and wrote the poem within a few days. The New Colossus, which is the title of the poem, was read at the inauguration ceremony, appeared in the auction catalog, and then essentially disappeared. Lazarus died in 1887 at the age of 38, without knowing that the poem would become perhaps the single text most associated with the most famous symbol of America. The poem was only engraved onto the base of the pedestal in 1903, 16 years after her death. Emma Lazarus wrote the text that defines the Statue of Liberty for most people, and never knew she had done it. But let us return to what was mentioned at the beginning, the original meaning that was erased. Laboulaye, the man who had the original idea in 1865, was thinking specifically about the abolition of slavery when he conceived the project. The context was unambiguous. The Civil War had just ended, the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, and Lincoln, the president who signed the abolition, had been assassinated. Laboulaye wanted to celebrate that specific moment. There are historical records suggesting that Bartholdi's original design included broken chains not only under the feet of the statue, as they are today, but in the hands. The female figure would have held broken chains as an explicit symbol of the abolition of slavery. That image was modified during the design process. The torch replaced the chains in the raised hand. The chains moved to under the feet, less visible, less explicit, and the narrative around the statue was gradually redirected, from a monument to abolition, to a monument to Franco-American friendship, to a monument to liberty in general, to a monument to immigration. Each redirection made the message more universal, more palatable, more marketable. And each redirection erased a little more of the fact that the statue was conceived at a moment when the deepest moral wound in American history had just been formally, if not completely, addressed. Scholars including historian Philip Napoli and others have documented this narrative transformation in detail. This is not conspiracy theory. It is the documented history of how symbols are shaped by whoever controls the story told around them. The broken chains are under the feet of the statue to this day. You do not see them clearly in standard aerial photographs. You would need to be at the base, looking up. But they are there. On July 30th, 1916 at 2 in the morning, a massive explosion shook New York. Black Tom Island in New Jersey, approximately 1,000 feet from Bedloe's Island where the Statue of Liberty stands, was a munitions depot storing weapons and explosives destined for Britain and France during the First World War. German agents sabotaged it. The explosion was equivalent to a magnitude 5.5 earthquake. Windows shattered as far as 40 miles away. Metal fragments reached Ellis Island, and the Statue of Liberty received shrapnel that damaged the torch severely enough that visitor access to the interior of the torch was ended. Ended temporarily, it was assumed at the time. To this day, more than 100 years later, the torch remains closed to visitors. You can climb to the crown. You can see the torch up close from the outside, but entering the torch, which was possible until 1916, has never again been permitted since the German sabotage. The most iconically photographed part of the statue, that raised torch that appears on every postcard, every film, every photograph, is the one place in the entire statue where no visitor has set foot since 1916. And here we arrive at something that the standard account touches only briefly, but which deserves to be stated with full clarity. The Statue of Liberty stands in a country that, at the moment of its inauguration, still denied basic political rights to the majority of its population. In 1886, women could not vote in the United States. Black Americans, nominally freed 21 years earlier, faced the Jim Crow era, segregation laws, systematic violence, the suppression of voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. Indigenous peoples had been driven from their lands in ongoing campaigns. Workers were exploited in conditions that today would be called abusive. In that context, a woman holding a torch of liberty is either a promise or a cruel joke, depending on where you stand. And the honest answer is that it was both things simultaneously. It was a promise because the ideal existed. The words of liberty, equality, and government of the people were written in the founding documents of the country, and that mattered even when reality did not yet correspond. It was a cruel joke, because for the people who looked at that statue from outside a system that excluded them, the distance between the symbol and the reality was an open wound. Frederick Douglass, the former enslaved man who became one of the most eloquent advocates for civil rights of the 19th century, said about the celebrations of American Independence Day, something that applies perfectly to the Statue of Liberty, that the greatness of American symbols is inseparable from American shame, that you cannot speak of one without speaking of the other. The statue does not deny that contradiction. In a certain sense, it exposes it, a figure that is impossible to ignore, which says that this country committed itself to an ideal, and which can now be held to that commitment. There is another physical aspect of the statue that time and mythology have tended to smooth over: what was happening on the inside. For decades after the inauguration, the galvanic corrosion between the iron internal skeleton and the external copper that Eiffel had tried to prevent with asbestos insulation was doing exactly what Eiffel feared. The asbestos degraded over time. The iron and the copper came into contact. Rust began to corrode the internal structure. In 1980, an inspection revealed that the situation was more serious than imagined. Many of the iron bars connecting the skeleton to the copper shell were severely corroded. The statue was not in immediate danger of collapse, but it was clearly deteriorating from the inside while remaining beautiful on the outside. The restoration carried out between 1984 and 1986, in time for the statue's centennial, was one of the most complex engineering projects in American history. The entire internal skeleton was replaced, with every iron bar exchanged for a stainless steel alloy bar. The asbestos was removed and replaced with Teflon. The original torch, which had been altered in 1916 and again in subsequent decades with glass windows that caused more damage than they prevented, was replaced with a copper replica gilded in gold leaf. The torch you see today is not the original torch. It is a 1986 replica. The original torch is inside the museum at the base of the statue. This means that the most iconically reproduced detail of the Statue of Liberty, the golden torch that appears on every poster and every tourist image, is less than 40 years old. What makes the Statue of Liberty unique among the world's monuments is not its beauty. It is not its engineering, even though that engineering is extraordinary. It is not its history, even though that history is remarkable. It is its position. Bartholdi understood something about symbolic communication that very few architects and artists understand as instinctively. A symbol does not work in a vacuum. It works in relation to a context, to a moment, to a trajectory. The Statue of Liberty is not just on an island in front of New York. It is on the path of arrival. It is in the way. During the period of greatest European immigration to the United States between 1890 and 1920, more than 12 million people passed through Ellis Island. Every single one of them, arriving by ship, saw the statue before they saw anything else of America, before any medical inspection, before any immigration form, before any American official. There was a 46-meter figure holding a torch. What did that figure say to a person who had traveled weeks in the hold of a crowded ship, who had left a country that had persecuted or simply starved them, who did not speak the language, who had no guarantee of anything? They say that many immigrants came up on deck when the ship entered New York Harbor and went silent when they saw the statue. Not necessarily in reverence, in something more complex. The recognition that something had ended and something was beginning, a signal before any word. That is what Bartholdi had calculated on that dawn in 1871, looking at an empty island in New York Harbor. Not a work of art to be contemplated, an object to be encountered at the right moment, in the right emotional state, at the exact point between what was left behind and what lay ahead. The Statue of Liberty has survived 2 terrorist attacks, Black Tom in 1916 and the September 2001 attacks, after which it was closed for security reasons and only partially reopened years later. It survived Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which flooded parts of the island and damaged the infrastructure surrounding the base. It survived decades of air pollution that accelerated the formation of patina and caused surface damage to the copper. It survived its own meaning, changing multiple times across 140 years. What is remarkable is not that it lasted. It is that with each generation, the statue finds a new group of people for whom it means something specific and urgent. For the immigrants of 1900, it was a signal of arrival. For the soldiers departing for the Second World War who saw it from the ship, it was the last image of America they might ever see. For refugees today who arrive by other means but look at photographs of it, it still represents a promise that the country does not always keep but has never formally revoked. Symbols are more resilient than the countries that create them, more resilient than the intentions of their creators, more resilient than the contradictions they carry. And perhaps the quietest detail of all is what is under her feet. If you visit Liberty Island today and look up from the base of the statue, you will see the chains. They are not hidden, but they are not highlighted either. They are there, broken, as if the figure had just freed herself, as if the act of rupture were recent rather than historical. Bartholdi placed them there deliberately, and the fact that most visitors do not see them, that most famous photographs of the statue do not show them, that decades passed before historians examined them with the attention they deserve, says something about how we read the symbols we choose. We see what we want them to mean. We ignore what complicates us. The broken chains under the feet of the Statue of Liberty are the original meaning of the monument. They are the story Laboulaye wanted to tell in 1865 at a dinner party in Versailles, when he was thinking about the newly freed enslaved people and a country attempting, imperfectly and painfully, to become what its founding documents had promised. That story was buried under layers of more convenient narrative, but the chains are still there, just as the original torch, preserved inside the museum, just as the poem of Emma Lazarus, written by a woman who died before she knew she had defined a national symbol, just as Eiffel's skeleton, invisible from the outside but responsible for everything you can see. The Statue of Liberty is a palimpsest, an object on which multiple stories have been written and rewritten, each one partially covering the one before it, but never completely erasing it. Underneath everything, if you know where to look, the first story is still there. The story of a dream of liberation, built in copper just 2.4 millimeters thick, that crossed the Atlantic in pieces, was raised with the pennies of immigrants and workers, survived sabotage and hurricanes and wars, and still stands, with chains under her feet and a torch in her hand, reminding anyone willing to listen that freedom is not a permanent condition. It is a decision that has to be made again every single day.